Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was a kid, I remember that my grandfather is from Finland, and he fought in World War II, and I remember that he got a pension. And I remember thinking that was strange. Just when I was a kid, I didn't understand how that worked, because it was a pension that came from Finland. He didn't even live there anymore. He had emigrated, Kaarina and Tauno, my grandparents, they emigrated from Finland to Canada, and yet the Finnish government still supported my grandfather. And then when he passed away, that pension went on to my grandmother, my mummu. And as a kid, I remember that was the first time I ever thought about that obligation that a country has to its servicemen and women. It was the first time I really thought about what it was. You know, I knew my grandfather had fought in the war, I understood that, but I didn't understand what it meant to sign up for something different, to sign up and say, I am going to fight for this country and I'm going to put my own life on the line. Mr. Speaker, as you know, I'm the Member of Parliament for Halifax. I've not served in Canada's military, unlike a couple of our previous speakers and other members of this House, but as the Member of Parliament for Halifax, home to Canadian Forces Base Halifax, I've learned a lot about our military and about our veterans over the years, both as the representative but also somebody who lives in this city. It's difficult not to know at least a bit about the Canadian Forces if you live in Halifax. CFB Halifax is Canada's East Coast Navy base, and it's home port to Maritime Forces Atlantic. It's the largest Canadian Forces base in terms of number of posted personnel, and anywhere you go around the Halifax Harbour, you're going to see evidence of the Canadian Forces. And as the MP for Halifax, I've had the opportunity to see firsthand the work that's happening at HMC Dockyard Halifax, one of the oldest defence establishments in Canada. I've attended events at Stadacona, which is in the north end of Halifax, and I've visited the Halifax Military Family Resource Centre on many occasions. And Mr. Speaker, shortly after my election in 2008, I had the opportunity to go on the inaugural sail of HMCS Halifax by her new captain, Captain José Kurtz, the first woman to command a Canadian warship. That was an incredibly special event, as Captain Kurtz actually took women from the community on her inaugural sail with her. And before I go on, Mr. Speaker, I do want to note that I will be splitting my time with the member for London Fanshawe. And in this time living in Halifax and representing Halifax, I've learned two key things about the men and women who serve. So the first thing I learned, Mr. Speaker, is that our military men and women are us. They're us, Mr. Speaker. They're not separate from us, walled off on a base that's isolated and different. CFB Halifax is part of our city, and the men and women serving there are part of the Halifax community. They are our soccer coaches. They're our neighbours who offer you a hand shoveling the driveway, and Lord knows we had a lot of that this winter. There are volunteer firefighters. There are community board volunteers. They are part of our communities, Mr. Speaker, and our communities are part of them. The second thing that I've learned is that while they are members of our community, they are different. Every day, they go into work and they make an extraordinary personal commitment, a commitment that is much more extraordinary than the one that you or I make, Mr. Speaker. When I worked at Dalhousie Legal Aid in Halifax, I went to work in the morning, I served my clients, I came home at the end of the day. My colleague from New Westminster Coquitlam quoted from the Equitas Statement of Claim. As you heard in this House, Mr. Speaker, there is a court case going on right now. And he quoted from the Statement of Claim, and I'd like to repeat this quote because I think it really sums up how our servicemen and women are different. Quote, "When members of the Canadian Forces put on the uniform of their country, they make an extraordinary personal commitment to place the welfare of others ahead of their personal interests, to serve Canada before self, and to put themselves at risk as required in the interests of the nation. A veteran whether regular or reserve, active or retired, is someone who, at one point in their life, wrote a blank check made payable to the Government of Canada for an amount up to and including their life. That blank check made payable to our country is not something that most of us have to write every day when we go to work. So while our servicemen and women are coaching our kids at soccer or helping raise money for the United Way in our communities, they're also unlike most of us in our community. And that difference, that blank check of up to and including their life, is what creates our obligation, the obligation of our country, of our government, to honor that commitment with a standalone covenant. A moral, social, legal, and fiduciary obligation exists between the Canadian people and the government to provide equitable financial compensation and support services to past and active members of the Canadian Armed Forces who have been injured, disabled, or have died as a result of military service. The government is obligated to fulfill this covenant. Canadian Forces veterans and their families deserve our deepest gratitude, and they deserve to be taken care of. But too many veterans and their families still cannot access adequate health care, pensions, and other vital supports, including closure of 9 frontline Veterans Affairs offices in this country. I want to thank my colleague from Sackville Eastern Shore for helping us lead the way on proposals to improve programs and services available for veterans and their families. Mr. Speaker, the NDP, we have a plan to end service pension clawbacks, to reopen shuttered Veterans Affairs offices, and widen access to quality home care, long-term care, and mental health services. I also want to thank my colleague from New Westminster Coquitlam for bringing forward this important motion, and my colleague from Châteauguay-Saint-Constant for seconding this motion. Thanks to their hard work, this issue gets the important debate it deserves. Mr. Speaker, our country has a long history of standing up for the rights and freedoms that Canadians hold dear. The men and women who join the Canadian Forces know they may be called upon to risk their lives on behalf of Canada and to uphold peace, security, or human rights here at home and around the world. For those who accept the condition of unlimited liability, we honor their service, and we're grateful for their personal sacrifices, including the sacrifices made by their families. You may have heard earlier the minister made reference to what was a saying. It's now quite an outdated saying that says, if the military wanted you to have a family, they'd issue you one. The first time I ever heard that saying, it was actually during a meeting with then Rear Admiral Madison at the Halifax dockyard. And of course, that's a totally outdated saying. It isn't true today. Canadian Forces has put a lot of work into supporting military families and acknowledging the role that families play in supporting our military servicemen and women. I've had opportunities to see that kind of support firsthand in talking to military families and see the special work that the Halifax Military Family Resource Centre does to support families in the Halifax area. That's why the Social Covenant acknowledges our veterans, but also acknowledges the families. It acknowledges that our nation and its government and citizens will support these men and women on their missions, honor their service, and look after them and their families if they are injured or die in the service of their country. Recognizing this covenant between the Canadian people and our government with past and active members of the Canadian Armed Forces is essential. This covenant honors their service and their personal sacrifices, and as I said, includes the sacrifices made by their families. To highlight that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read to you a quote from Dr. Stéphanie Bélanger from the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research. Quote, "There is a social covenant, and this is what started the Research Institute. It's being studied as well in military ethics studies. There is lots of evidence that social covenants existing in every country where the government will task people with the clause of unlimited liability, and because of this clause, there is an obligation to serve back." End quote. I think that sums it up perfectly, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud to stand today to speak to this motion. I will be proud to vote for it, and I encourage my colleagues across this House to support this motion.
Order. À l'ordre, conformément à l'article 38 du règlement, je dois faire connaître à la Chambre les questions qu'elle abordera à l'heure d'ajoutement ce soir. The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe on employment et l'honorable député de Drummond sur le développement économique régional. Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg, the Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend for her remarks. Certainly, she knows that I served in the military in Halifax for a number of years before we met at Dalhousie Law School, and I'm glad she talked about the important role the Military Family Resource Centre in Halifax plays, and the one at Shearwater as part of the larger Halifax regional municipality. And I was struck by her comments confirming what I've said many times, that men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces are indeed us, Mr. Speaker. They are Canadians from all walks of life, all parts of the country that step forward to serve. And that's why the Veterans Charter was created, Mr. Speaker, to move to a system that looked at rehabilitation, looked at wellness, looked at family, allowed for supports for not just physical injuries but mental injuries. That's why it was brought in by the Liberals in 2005. That's why it's still a good system with the fixes we have in Bill C-58, with the Retirement Income Security Benefit, Critical Injury Benefit, Family Caregiver Benefit, a number of the modernization updates to the Veterans Charter. My question to her is twofold. One, as Deputy Leader of her party, can she urge her leadership to get behind Bill C-58? Most of Bill C-58 was agreed unanimously last June by the Standing Committee, including her critic. So why don't we move this through the House? Because it represents benefits and improvements to families. But more importantly, I've said we support the motion brought forward today, but Bill C-58, the purpose clause talking about the obligation, actually goes further. It includes all veterans and our obligation to all veterans, not just those injured, and it directly states that it should be liberally construed, which is what the Standing Committee wanted. So by getting behind C-58, we go further than the motion brought forward today by the member from Westminster Coquitlam. So I'd ask her to get her party to support it.
The Honourable Member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, I was just looking for my wording from C-58. I don't have it in front of me. But I thank the Minister for his question, and I think he does know that there are parts of C-58 that the NDP can support. But the problem is when Conservatives put everything together, everything plus the kitchen sink, it forces those of us who want to support good parts of legislation, it forces us to vote against, because you can't include these other egregious parts. So I don't understand why it is government doesn't want to work with opposition parties to say, okay, what can we agree on here? Is there some piece that we can pull out and actually work on together? And then I think, you know, the Minister has had some very good words about the Veterans Charter. This motion actually talks about that fiduciary duty and creating that fiduciary duty with this covenant. And I think that fiduciary duty will give government a chance to pause and to have a second thought about how their actions are actually reflecting that fiduciary duty, especially when you look at the amount of money and time and energy that's been taken by this government to fight veterans in courts. I would hope that having a fiduciary duty would give government pause before they embark in these kind of lawsuits that are so wasteful of everybody's time and our money.
Questions and comments. Question and commentaire. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'd just like to quote directly from the Act stating the purpose and then ask for a response from the member. The purpose of this Act, and this is C-58, is to recognize and fulfill the obligation of people and Government of Canada to show just and due appreciation to the members and veterans for their service to Canada. This obligation includes providing services, assistance and compensation to members and veterans who have been injured or have died as a result of military service, and extends to their spouses or common law partners or survivors and orphans. This Act 10 shall be liberally interpreted so that the recognized obligation may be fulfilled. Mr. Speaker, it is no doubt a wonderful, wonderful platitude that is being expressed in the purpose of the legislation that the Minister just made reference to, but I'm wondering if the member would provide some comment in regards to the reality. Does she believe the reality of the last few years reflects what the purpose of Bill C-58 has actually, and the Minister is talking about?
The honourable member for Halifax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question, and also thank him for reading out the purpose, because that's not what I could find in front of me. Lots of paper here. He's right to point out that disconnect between the words and the reality. Again, that's why I go back to this idea of actually creating a fiduciary duty, so that we have this sense of duty that informs every single step we take as legislators. And that disconnect is very real. I mean, we have seen veterans' offices shut down, 9 regional Veterans Affairs offices shut down across Canada. We have seen layoffs at Veterans Affairs Canada. I'm from Kirkland Lake, Ontario, which has a regional office in Kirkland Lake, a DVA, Department of Veterans Affairs regional office, and I've seen the impact that it's had on my hometown. I've seen that money has been left over at the end of the year and given back to the Treasury Board when there are veterans who are going to food banks, when there are veterans that are not able to make ends meet. And we're not alone in this, Mr. Speaker. There are veterans across Canada who are standing behind what we're saying, who've spoken out publicly, who've said, we need help. Where can we get this help? And so that's that disconnect, and hopefully something like a social covenant will guide a government, no matter what color or party affiliation, will help guide a government in making those decisions.